And this video is going to focus on the powers of the vice presidency. We've already talked about the vice presidency a little bit as we've gone through the executive branch unit. We talked about previously that vice presidents and presidents weren't always running as like a package deal, that the old system was first place in a presidential election became the president, and the second place became the vice president. And again, clearly, this just doesn't work in a modern time period anymore. The evolution of political parties, the development of political parties, make it almost like impossible that you're going to have effective government if you have a president of one party and a vice president of the other. So this has changed. Obviously, the 12th Amendment sort of allows the president and vice presidential candidates to run as a package deal. You knew that in 2020, a vote for President Biden was a vote for Kamala Harris as like vice president. So we've already talked about this, but this is just a little quick review. In terms of the vice presidency, there are some constitutionally based responsibilities, and then there are some things that the vice president does that kind of just has evolved over the course of history, but that you couldn't find in the Constitution as like stated powers of the vice president if you looked. So we're going to take a real quick look at the constitutional based responsibilities first. So these are the things that, like, if you looked in the Constitution, you'd be able to see that these are powers or responsibilities given to the vice president. The first is presidential succession. So clearly, the VP is first in order of takeover. If something happens to the president, then the vice president becomes the new president, right? So there have been 15 total vice presidents that have eventually become presidents throughout American history. Nine of them became president by essentially taking over for the person that they were originally serving as vice president for. Whether that original president, died of natural causes, was assassinated, was forced to resign or chose to resign. These people on the screen jumped up to become president, right? So obviously, 9 times in the course of our country's history, the vice president has been sort of called into duty and has had to become like the acting like president, right? Interestingly enough, that leaves 6 vice presidents that have been able to get elected on their own without having to fill in first. So John Adams was the first vice president to get elected without having to like jump into the president's seat for a little bit first. He was George Washington's vice president. Thomas Jefferson followed him. This guy right here, he was Adams's vice president. Martin Van Buren was Andrew Jackson's vice president in the 1830s. Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. George H.W. Bush was Reagan's vice president, and Biden was Obama's vice president. So it's definitely more of a common path that VPs that go on to be president have to like jump up and serve in that role for a little bit first. But there are 6 examples of vice presidents that were able to get elected without having to do that first. And then the other major constitutional responsibility of the vice president is that the vice president is also president of the Senate. There are some ceremonial responsibilities that come with this, but largely the vice president is not going to be spending a whole lot of time in the Senate fulfilling this role. The most important responsibility that comes along with this role is that the vice president, who is the president of the Senate, would most only vote generally in the case of if there's a tiebreaker. So that's significant that the VP is the tie-breaking vote. There are 100 senators, so it's a possibility that you could have a tie in the Senate. It is the responsibility of the VP to cast that tie-breaking vote. Over the course of American history, there have been 293 tie-breaking votes from vice presidents, from 37 different vice presidents. So this is not something that happens like a ton throughout the course of American history, only 293 examples to this point. The vice president who has the distinction of casting the most tie-breaking votes is John Calhoun, who served as VP from 1825 to 1832. Kind of like leads the way with 31 tie-breaking votes, but it's interesting to see that VP Kamala Harris, who is Biden's vice president, already ranks 3rd on the all-time list with 26 tie-breaking votes. And that's largely a product of the fact that it's a 50-50 split in the Senate right now between Democrats and Republicans. So clearly, Harris is being called to break tie-breaking votes a bit more often just because of the balance of power that currently exists. And then in terms of just sort of like traditional or again informal based responsibilities, informal again meaning like you're not going to find these in the Constitution, these powers and responsibilities, but vice presidents have kind of done them. Is supporting the president's policies. Right? And this is a great example. This is Vice President Pence, who during the initial coronavirus outbreak was basically leading the task force to deal with COVID, was often giving like daily press conferences. One of the major things that the vice president does is travel the country in support of the president's policies, trying to rally support for the president, giving lots of speeches, meeting with lots of people, but every once in a while, like vice presidents are put in sort of charge of specific tasks, like Pence was, right, where he was leading the COVID response like task force. But again, this is like informal kind of stuff. This is what vice presidents have come to do is just sort of supporting the president's policies in any way that they can. They can. And the other significant thing that's not really like in the Constitution, but that definitely makes vice presidents significant is that vice presidents often, you could argue, the most important thing that vice presidents do ends the day that their president gets elected. Oftentimes, vice presidents are used again to what we call balance the ticket, which means initially when the vice president is chosen, they're chosen to run with the designated president because the vice president is perceived as making up for some sort of deficiency or weakness that that presidential candidate has. Like maybe the president isn't necessarily appealing to a certain group of people, or there's perceived weakness in that presidential candidate. So you choose a vice president to run with you that maybe makes up for those weaknesses. For example, if you're considered to be not experienced enough, maybe you run with a vice president that is considered to be more experienced. Or if you're considered to be too young, maybe you run for with somebody that's a bit like older. Look, this is a great example. Obama and Biden, when Barack Obama became president in 2008, he was, not even through one full term in the Senate yet and was pretty young. So one of the criticisms of then Senator Obama was that he wasn't experienced enough to be president of the United States. So he selected Joe Biden, a longtime senator from Delaware, to be his VP running mate, someone that could help him through the job and learn on the job. Again, Obama was considered to be too young, too inexperienced, so he paired up himself with somebody that was considerably older and more experienced, right? And sometimes it's worked the other way too. If a presidential candidate is considered to be too old, maybe you run with somebody that's a bit younger. Or race can sometimes be a factor, or gender, or geography, right? A place where the president comes from. If the president's from like the South, maybe you select a vice president that would appeal to a different segment of the country, like somebody from the North or somebody from the West, or even like ideology. If a president is considered to be, pretty extreme as either pretty diehard liberal or conservative, maybe you pair yourself up with a bit more of a moderate. Or if you're maybe more of a moderate, maybe you pair yourself up with somebody that appeals to maybe the more extreme ideological members of your party. So again, balancing the tickets not in the Constitution, but a lot of presidents do it. They find someone that is going to appeal to some groups as vice president that maybe they don't as president.